Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this conversation about Equity 101 culture. And so today we're really going to be stepping into defining an equitable school culture. What does that look like? What are the characteristics? What are the considerations? Just while I'm getting started here, again, any of you who've joined in, if you could go down into the questions section and just list your title and where you're from so we can know everyone who is with us today. And I want to acknowledge Bob Orfield, who's the Director of School Improvement in Calhoun City Schools, Calhoun, Georgia. Georgia's a place I've done a lot of work over the years. Seems every year I get there almost feels like a half dozen times, so I'm not sure if I've been in Calhoun City Schools. Jason Galitsky, Partner Success Manager with School Improvement Network, based out of Florida, who's been a participant in all of these so far. Cynthia Brogan, Assistant Principal in Burke County, Georgia, so second Georgia participant. Again, all my work in Georgia, and I don't know if I've actually been to Burke County, so forgive me for that. Haley Rutzert, who is with us from Massillon University. Haley, where is that university? And forgive me if I've decimated the pronunciation of the name of your university. I'm actually unfamiliar with your institute and just want to know where it's at. So I'm Curtis Linton. I am the Chief Learning Officer at School Improvement Network, and my work has been focused over time on really looking at equity in schools. And so most of my work has been focused on a successful practice approach, and which means searching out schools that are doing amazing things with kids and studying what it is on a day-by-day basis, looking at those common practices and linking them back out to the research that exists. And so the goal always is to say, how can a school actually do this? Haley, thanks for letting me know, in Edmonton, Alberta. So great city up there. I was actually in Alberta this summer, just gorgeous country. And of course, any of the rest of you who'd like to share who you are and where you're from, I'd love to know. So as we think about equitable school culture, this is a piece where this conversation today is not going to be precise in terms of specific strategies and whatnot that you can turn around and do tomorrow. We're really going to be looking more at culture as a state of being. And what I mean by that is that culture tends to be quite abstracted. Culture is something we create and we live in over time versus a specific action that we take today. But I hope you will join with me in this conversation because it's an awesome one. I mean, when you really think about what is that culture where any student, no matter who they are, where they come from, full recognition of their background, their needs, their interests, their approach to learning. What is that school environment that can take this child in and give them a safe place and allow them to thrive? And so that's really the focus of our conversation today. So to begin, I want you to engage your mind a bit around this. And so here's a photo of me. This is me in second grade, long time ago. Straight up white kid growing up in the suburbs of Salt Lake City, Utah. And that was entirely the experience I knew. I knew nothing other than this. And so I grew up with a particular experience. I knew how I looked upon the world. I understood how my family looked upon the world. I knew that when I went into school, there were certain experiences I could count on. When I looked at my teachers, they looked like me. They sounded like me. They had similar belief sets. And so my cultural experience in school was really one of being normed. Here's the photo of this cute little kid here. This is also a little younger than second grade. But this is my son, Dominic. And so I hope you can see by looking at the screen, there's one primary screaming at you difference between the two of us. I'm white, my son is black. So what does that mean? Well, first off, for someone who works in education, to have had a successful educational experience, through K-12, trusted the school system that I would succeed all the way through, and knowing later on as an adult through my research and studies and all the rest that school is not an equal experience for every student. Now raising a black child, taking him through the school system, through a school system that has really good, solid intentions, but it's also a school system here in Salt Lake City, Utah, where we live, that has significant racial inequity. So from day one, as Dominic starts school, and I love Dominic, he's an amazing kid. I want him to have every opportunity that I grew up with. But from day one, I know that he's going into a school system that statistically does not support all of its students to the same performance level year after year after year. So how do I interpret that? First off, I can say, well, Dominic is my son. This isn't going to happen to him. It only happens to the other kids of color in the system. That doesn't give me a lot of safety, because then Dominic's experience is entirely dependent upon his teachers knowing that I am his father. White, educated, upper middle class, works in education, the whole deal. And so as I think about an equitable school culture, and the reason why, and if any of you have heard me talk before, I'm always focusing back in on this experience of Dominic, of my son growing up. A truly equitable school culture is where Dominic shows up and it's not dependent upon their knowledge of me for him to be in a situation that he thrives, so that he can blend in with other kids of color, other white kids, poor kids, rich kids, you name it. All of them are going to a school where they are thriving and they are succeeding. And so I want you to start, I shared this story about myself to begin, but I really want you to start with this reflection. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes here. Go down into the question box or the chat box. If you go to the question box, everyone will see it. If you go into the chat box, just I will see it. But I want you to reflect on how your school or school system's culture inhibits equity. And I'm looking for evidence here, so get specific, drill down deeper than just a general belief set, societal issues. What are specific things you can think of in the next couple of minutes that inhibit equity in your school or school system? And then I'll share out some of these responses. So as I see responses come in, I will go ahead and share those out with the group. So please, in the question box there, just write about what do you see in your school's culture that inhibits equity. So Jason writes in and says geography, the west side of the county versus the east side of the county, the haves and have-nots. Without question, I'm there with you on that. Now, through this one, particularly this topic of culture, I will often talk about my local school system, Salt Lake City. And again, I'm not trying to be overly critical. It's just it's a system I've spent a lot of time observing. We have a similar geographical problem. And one of the interesting things, how geography impacts this. So think about Salt Lake City. It's a capital city, thriving economy, and there's unquestionably an east side and a west side. East side is professional, upper upper middle class, primarily white. West Side is a working class, primarily of color. Well, when you look at the district, 2/3 of the student population is on the West Side. So from those communities, they're primarily of color. In fact, the school district, Salt Lake School District itself, is 65% students of color. So 2/3 of the students in the system come from the West Side. 2/3 of the students are of color, which means 1/3 of the students are white, 1/3 of the students come from the East Side of the district. But school board participation or school board districts are based on voters, not on students. And since Salt Lake City is is a capital city, there are a lot of voters who don't have children. Well, 2/3 of the voters in Salt Lake City are on the East Side, 1/3 of the voters are on the West Side. So 1/3 of the school board represents 2/3 of the students. 2/3 of the school board represents 1/3 of the student. It is a straight up geographical divide, and it's a racial divide. It's fascinating to look at. Salt Lake's not the only place I've seen this, but it's a very real situation. So thank you for sharing that issue about geography, Jason. Robert writes in and says, discipline may sometimes inhibit equity. To dispense discipline without determining why the student behavior was inappropriate. Robert, thanks for sharing this. I mean, it is, one of the things I love, when I began this work, we would talk about this issue of discipline more in the abstract or through qualified stories and individual examples. But the research in the last decade that has come out about this is straight up, it's profound. There's a lot of research that has been done that shows this distinct racial disparity and inequity. And one of the most interesting pieces of research, and I wish I could quote the authors of the study, but they specifically were looking at the no tolerance policy. So a no tolerance policy in its very title means no flexibility, right? If a kid shows up to school with something that is a weapon, the kid is expelled, no tolerance. Well, even looking at no tolerance policies, straight up racial disparity, unquestionable. And this is looking at local systems, it's also looking at issues across many school systems. So, in a no tolerance policy, well, some kids still get away with it. And so you can look and say, how is it that a discipline policy actually inhibits equity? And so it's a fascinating consideration. Love to see some of you, some of the rest of you respond on this. I mean, we need to talk about these specific things because this is really where the richness of our analysis comes through. So Robert, you spoke about discipline. Jason, you spoke about geography. Two strong things. What are some other things that inhibit equity at your school? There are things such as teacher assignment. Things such as, do the teachers actually represent the cultural backgrounds, the racial backgrounds, whatnot, of the students? We're going to be getting into some other pieces around this as well throughout the webinar. And so I want to throw up this picture here. And it's an interesting picture. Again, this is my son, Dominic. And I invite you to look at this. So this was his preschool experience. We take this photo and I look at it. And so two things immediately stand out. One, my son is racially isolated in this. He's the only brown kid in that lineup. And it's stark, the contrast as you go from student to student. But the other interesting thing about this is, as well, and this is where I think this picture for me has become symbolic. So Dominic stands out starkly in the sense that he's the kid of color among a lot of white kids. But the other thing, too, in this picture is that he kind of fades away. And so what happens to a child who is culturally isolated in an environment? Well, half their experience is that they stand out as isolated, and the other half of their experience is that they kind of disappear. Their own personal needs are forgotten and are not considered. So think about that impact on a child. On one hand, I'm hyper-visible, and on the other, I'm invisible. So where do I stand? So and this again was in preschool. It was the Christmas program. I look at it, but it's a picture that I've always remembered, as a parent, but also as an educator. What happens when we have a school environment where kids who are different are not allowed to be the norm? And that's really the basis of our cultural conversation today. So, as I pose this question to you, I want you to consider this. Is an equitable school culture an equal school culture? What are your thoughts? Please type in your answer to this question, or your thoughts. It's not an answer, but your thoughts on this question in the dialogue box, in the question box. Is an equitable school culture an equal school culture? EQU, it's the root of both words. Equality is, a root word within equitable, but is an equitable school culture an equal school culture? And while people are responding, Dave, I'm wondering if you can help out Blessy Joseph here, who says that her volume is not working.
I will do what I can.
Thanks. But I'd love to see your responses. Is an equitable school culture an equal school culture? Okay, so Cynthia writes in and says, kids have unique needs, and we would not do them justice if we insisted on equal. This is the core problem of equity, is that our policy tends towards implementing equal treatment, equal support, equal solutions, but that runs headlong into the reality that, as Cynthia says here, kids show up with unique needs. So it's this balance of the uniqueness of each child that comes in with our policies that have tended to focus on equal treatment. Robert writes, equitable is not equal because children have different needs. If everything is equal, children that are behind will always stay behind. So as we look at an equitable school culture, what we have to remember is that when we push towards equal, we're assuming an equal entrance. But an equitable school aims towards an equal exit. And so so many of our educational programs are designed assuming this equality as the kids enter school. But that is fundamentally where the difference occurs. And so in equity, we're shifting this and saying, well, if each student is coming in different at the entrance, we're going to provide differentiated, unique supports for each student, but we're going to hold them to an equal eventual standard of performance. We want our exit to be equal. So the promise to the student is when you complete 12th grade and you move on, you're equally prepared to your classmates. But in order to get to that equal exit, we've got to make the rest of the system equitable, responsive to those unique needs. So I put this definition up here for consideration. What is cultural equity? Well, cultural equity is school culture that invests in understanding the cultural backgrounds, characteristics, and needs of each student, while also fostering a learning culture that supports and expects high levels of engagement and student success. Cultural equity, school culture that invests in understanding the cultural backgrounds, characteristics, and needs of each student, while also fostering a learning culture that supports and expects high levels of engagement and student success. So there are two elements to this equitable culture. This is what we're exploring. One is, what is my cultural proficiency as an educator? But then the other is, what is the learning culture that the school supports? Student needs both. Student needs to know, you get me. But then on the other part, when the student shows up, it needs to be a school culture that supports them in succeeding. So as we move through this, and Dave introduced School Improvement Network earlier, we've been in existence for 25 years now. And this is a family business. My parents actually founded this business 25 years ago. And remember what I said, I grew up in a suburb of Salt Lake City in a very white environment. Diversity was not part of my experience growing up. But through this family business, as we plodded away and worked year after year after year, filming in schools all over the country, we started to discover this amazing diversity that exists out there. And so I had to go through, and our whole company really went through this growth of having to shift our understanding away from assuming we understood the world based on our narrow experience and really saying, what's out there? And so it was a fascinating experience, and it was kind of over about a decade, from about 1995 to 2005, where we featured the work of a number of educational experts of color. So these were people working on this issue head on, listening to them, hearing their stories, coming to believe that what they present has incredible, is necessary for our dialogue around school improvement. It was a remarkable journey. So I give that as a bit of a background to School Improvement Network. We had to go through this journey ourselves of becoming culturally proficient. Now, do we have a lot more work to do? Absolutely. We have an immense amount of work to do. But our eyes were opened, and once the eyes are open, then we can really more engage in the learning much more efficiently. So School Improvement Network, we're your partner. What we provide is Edivate and non-Edivate and numerous resources focused on building truly equitable school cultures. And why do we do this? It goes back to that story that I opened with Dominic. I look at Dominic as a white father of a black son. I want him to have every opportunity that I had. It's not acceptable that Dominic's academic experience is somehow going to be lessened because of the color of his skin. And so why do we do this? We do this fundamentally for 100%. Does this mean 100% of students are going to be at grade level every year? Well, not exactly. But what we do know, because we've seen this in so many schools, is that 100% of kids can become highly engaged, can be personally supported, and can grow at significant levels in their knowledge and the skills that they need to gain. So this is why we do the work we do. So those of you who have participated in the previous equity webinars have seen this equitable school success formula. And Sadia, thank you for letting me know the audio keeps cutting out. I will make sure I'm keeping the microphone right next to me. Please let me know if it gets any better as I hold the microphone more still. So this equitable school success formula, the goal, of course, is actual equity, that all kids are succeeding. And so what are some components that we see as necessary to build an equitable school? Well, the first one is personalized learning. The second one is cultural proficiency. And the third one is successful implementation. If we're really talking about individually supporting each student, then we have to personalize the learning. That's key to this. How can we support each student by still delivering the same learning experience, the same curriculum in the same way to whole classrooms full of kids? So we have to personalize the learning. But we have to personalize the learning in a way that culturally works for each student. Now we can have these beliefs, yes, we're going to personalize the learning, and we're going to tailor it to the cultural background and understandings and needs of each student. But if we don't implement this successfully year after year in every grade, well, we won't get to actual equity. Because a student can't depend upon one or two or maybe three teachers who are highly skilled at this in order to have success. A student depends on a K through 12 experience systemically driving them towards an equitable educational experience. So here is our definition of equity. And again, forgive me if you've participated in the other webinars, but we have new participants today, so I want to make sure I put this up here. This is how we define educational equity. Educators provide all students with the individual support they need to reach and exceed a common standard. So educators are first and foremost responsible to do this. They provide all students, meaning all, no exceptions, with the individualized support. We've already started talking about this They need to reach and exceed a common standard. Why do we say a common standard? That goes back to the equal exit. An equitable school is one which succeeds at supporting all students so they are leaving equally prepared. How do you measure that? You measure that with a common performance standard that you expect of all kids. So that's our definition of equity. So as we look at the equity framework, and in the past 2 webinars I've talked about the equity framework in general, dived in last week into the components of leadership. Well, today we're really focusing on school culture. How do you successfully implement an equitable school culture? School culture is highly dependent upon the professional attitudes of the educators who work there every day. A clear focus on students. Every decision is being made on behalf of the students. You can only, of course we say that we do this all the time, but we can really only make every decision based on the students if we know who the students are, if we understand them personally. In an inclusive environment, every student who shows up has a place, is understood, is accepted with their strengths, accepted with their weaknesses, accepted on the days they succeed, and especially accepted on the days they struggle. And there has to be collaboration. Going back to that picture of Dominic in the lineup with his preschool students, collaboration is what allows a student to come out of the shadows and feel visible. So those are the elements of school culture as we focus in on school culture as part of the equity framework. So as we move on from this, I need to speak a bit about this evolution to student-centered. And so this graphic that I have up here is really presenting a standards-based teaching approach. And really since kind of the early 2000s, our focus has been to get teachers proficient at delivering learning in this particular structure. You begin with the teacher who looks at the standard that needs to be taught, then delivers it to the students, and then assesses whether or not they got it. So that's a standards-based teaching approach. But when we talk about a student-centered approach, well, now we have to begin with the student. When we study the student again and again every single day, but then in terms of supporting that student, we consider what are the skills that the teacher brings into the classroom, rather than the teacher's just going to deliver the learning. What are the particular skills that this teacher has that can impact this student in a positive way? What is the student's relationship into the standards, the proficiencies that they're supposed to master? So rather than the teacher thinking about, well, I've got to deliver curriculum that supports this standard, we're really now more saying, where's each individual student in relation to the standards? Okay, then how do we group students according to their needs? Choice and accountability has to be in here. When we're giving students of their learning. But when choice is devoid in the learning experience, we're basically asking students to hold themselves accountable to something they have no control over. And then this additional piece here, culture and relevancy. In the previous approach, the kind of standards-based approach, there is no room in here to modify the learning experience based upon the cultural background and cultural norms and relevancy that the student has, because it always begins with the teacher presenting a learning objective to the entire class. But when we move to a student-centered approach, well, now the teacher can consider interest, background, family histories, all these things which go into that realm of culture and relevancy. There's room for the student to learn, from the perspective of who they are and what they show up with in the classroom. I just think it's a good thing for us to keep in mind as we discuss equitable school culture. So going back to this equitable school culture, personalized learning plus cultural proficiency plus successful implementation, which leads to actual equity. So cultural proficiency, let's start with this one. So cultural proficiency centers on the student's relevant background, heritage, culture, race, gender, values, community, family, and interests. So when I think about a culturally proficient learning environment, well, this is one where the student can show up, knows that their heritage is recognized somehow within the curriculum, that their culture is honored within the school, who they are and what they come with, that their race is supported, that, you know, it's almost all throughout North America, well over 80% of educators are white. But also across North America, we're almost at 50% of kids of color. So is race an attribute which is recognized, the diversity of it, and honored within the school environment? Gender, values. Am I being presented values that may or may not coalesce with the values that my family and my culture hold? How are we challenging that? I mean, just to bring this straight to the forefront, you know, in the U.S., we've gone through a really contentious election. A lot of values have been presented on the airwaves in the public space that might not align with the values that a student shows up with. So as a school, how do we navigate that and make sure that a student is not being singled out for having a value that might be contrary to someone else? Community, family, interests. I really think the interest one is a big one here. You know, and too often the teacher is looking for ways to engage students based on the teacher's interest, rather than letting the students really say, this is what I'm most interested in. You know, a simple little example that I've used before. It's talking about a kid who loves soccer. Well, if I'm a teacher, I know that this student, you know, that Juan loves soccer. Great, I've now found an interest. But if I, the teacher, then go about defining what interest in soccer means, I've actually negated Juan's interest in soccer. I might be talking about World Cup soccer, or, you know, in North America, Major League Soccer, the MLS teams. Whereas my student might have a real fascination in Brazilian City League soccer. You have to let the student define the area of interest and then serve it to really engage that student. An awesome example of this is this video on the West Hawaiian Explorations Academy, or WEA, in Hawaii. And in the follow-up email, I will have Dave send out a link to this. And when you watch it, now this is a video which shows how good the school does project-based learning and whatnot. But listen to the students talk. It's a school which 100% honors and recognizes the interests and backgrounds the students show up with. It's beautiful. It's amazing. It's one of the craziest schools I've ever visited, but their success is phenomenal. So an equitable school culture, the school culture is based upon two factors: the culture of learning found within the school and the cultural competency, or the cultural proficiency of the school. Remember, this is both inward and outward. The outward aspect of this is the culture of learning within the school. The inward aspect of this on the part of the educators is their own cultural proficiency or competency. We have to keep these two things in mind. We can create an awesome learning environment, but if the educators are not proficient at understanding culturally what the kids show up with, well, the kids are going to remain disengaged from an awesome learning environment. With the inverse, we might have a set of educators who've invested heavily in understanding the cultural backgrounds of their students, but they haven't created a rich learning environment. So they might be able to connect with the students, but they aren't challenging them. They aren't pushing them towards higher levels of engagement and success. So these two things together, the culture of learning and the cultural competency of the school. So what do these look like? So as we go through these, let's start with the culture of learning. So here are some characteristics to consider. An equitable school culture that has a great culture of learning is highly collaborative. You know, students have a place. They're involved in the groups. The teachers collaborate with each other. Students collaborate with each other. Learning is a social activity. that has moments of individual study. But does the school really understand that learning is first and foremost social? How do they build that? How do they foster that element of collaboration? High expectations. It's fascinating. In many schools that we've been in, when we go in, the educators will talk about how they had to set this level of expectation that was above and beyond what the school system might have expected, what the community might have expected. But high expectations are embedded into it every day. It's my son Dominic, who I've been talking about, is in middle school now. He's in 6th grade. One of the things we've been focusing on this year is the quality of his work. He's getting his homework done, but his quality has suffered. And so high expectations is driving that. Is this of best quality? Can you do it a bit better? Safety and risk-taking. I really like this one. And when you think about this equitable school culture, this almost sounds contrary to each other. It has to be a safe environment, but also a risk-taking environment. The key way to think about this, are people free, are they safe to take risks? So let's look at it from the student perspective. If a student is not proficient at a particular concept, are they going to be graded once on their homework and once on their test and either deemed proficient or not? Good grade, bad grade. Or are they going to be allowed to stretch, to try again, to take that risk? Can they figure this out? Can they get creative in the way they're approaching their learning, even if success is not guaranteed, and have another chance to try again? So that's the part of the student. But think about your educators. Are educators free to take a risk? Are they safe to take a risk? How many times have you known that particular teacher who is really good with students but tends to close the door, doesn't want other teachers to know the things that are going on inside their classroom? Well, this is where safety and risk-taking really is important, because you want your innovative teachers to feel safe to take those risks, to develop new ways of engaging with students, and you want them sharing it with the faculty. And all innovations don't work. That's all right. The question is, are your educators working in a school culture, an environment that allows them to try new things, whether or not they work? And then obviously support for students and teachers. Can't have a great culture of learning without making sure that each individual teacher and student is supported within their needs. So that's a culture of learning. So going back to the question box, look at these 4 options. I'd love to see what you believe is the single most important factor of an effective school culture. 1, collaboration. 2, high expectations. 3, safety and risk-taking. Or 4, support. Of those 4, which one do you believe is the most important factor of an effective school culture? Go ahead and submit your responses. So Cynthia says high expectations. She identified high expectations. Jack identified safety and risk-taking. Number 3. Jason said high expectations. Number 2. Haley said high expectations. So as you look at these, here's a thought for you, and this is kind of providing a strategic approach for you to engage in building effective school culture. So we could make a serious argument that all 4 of these are needed. So yes, ask the question, which is the single most important factor? And we could, debate around that. Robert said collaboration is most important. Well, actually, Robert, you're kind of getting to what I'm trying to say here. Collaboration is most important because the high expectations, safety, and support must be agreed upon. But what I think you can use for yourself as a leader in a school environment, trying to increase this school culture. Look at these 4. The one that you naturally go to is saying high expectations is the most important. Collaboration or safety is the most important. use that as a launching pad. Because just the argument that Robert made about collaboration is most important because the other three depend upon it, you could make that same argument for each of these. You make the argument that high expectations is most important because that's what drives successful collaboration. You have high expectation that we can really grow as risk-taking, etc. You could do the same with safety and risk-taking. How can you really have high expectations without first embracing a truly safe and risk-taking environment? So you can make this argument for any of these. But this is a place for you to focus in on. Instead of saying, well, I've got to spend 25% of my effort in building school culture on each of these, take one of them. Build the others off of it. Group them. Collect them together. It's just a way for you to be able to focus so you can get more return on your investment, more return on that time you're putting in towards building school culture. So I love this quote from Beverly Daniel Tatum, and this is from her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Singing Together in the Cafeteria? She says, when somebody feels alienated, they're not likely learning. It's hard to intellectually engage if you're socially alienated. When we create a climate of engagement, we want to think of both social and intellectual engagement. And again, I push you to think back to that picture of my son Dominic in preschool. When somebody a really good first grade teacher, but he kind of struggled in preschool, struggled to connect in kindergarten. Second grade was definitely a tough year. It wasn't till third grade they had a teacher where he no longer felt alienated. And which is the year he thrived the most in his elementary experience? Without question, it was third grade, because he intellectually engaged because he was no longer socially alienated. So again, when we create a climate of engagement, we want to think of both social and intellectual engagement. Are they engaged with their peers? Are they engaged with their teacher? Well, now I can give them great learning material and engage them intellectually. So if equitable school culture is based upon a culture of learning and cultural competency, then we got to ask, so how do we define out cultural competency? So cultural competency is found within the school where educators understand themselves and their students according to race, economics, language, community, family background, gender, education levels, all the rest. And so cultural competency, do I as an educator understand what the student shows up with? The challenge with talking about cultural competency or cultural proficiency is it feels really abstract. And I'm speaking of this from personal experience. Remember what I said, I grew up in a very homogeneous environment, basically an all-white neighborhood, mostly all-white school. And so understanding difference was not a thing I came to naturally. And so I had to exercise on this. I had to work at this. What is meant by difference? It's looking at looking at sexual orientation. What is the experience of a gay person? This is not something I understood personally. And it wasn't until I reached out and I began to listen that it started to make sense. Now, still doesn't define my experience, but I can build empathy and knowledge towards understanding someone else's experience. So then when I'm in a situation where I might be alienating an individual, I can actually be aware of it. And so cultural competency is this process, and speaking specifically for educators, it's when educators go through a deliberate process to understand the values and cultures and backgrounds of their students. Part of this is very intellectual. It's reading histories, reading books on race and identity and heritage. Part of it is cultural. It's shopping in the stores in the neighborhood of your school where your students' families shop. It's thinking about going to a different church environment. Churches tend to be ultra homogenized. And so what if I was one Sunday to go to a church where a number of my students go to? You're going to experience culture the way they know it. Remember, to your students, their most immediate culture, the one they understand the best, the one that does not feel foreign, is the one they live in at home. which means school is always a bit foreign in comparison, for the student culturally. And so as educators go through this effort to say, I want to understand my students culturally, what skill are they gaining? They're gaining that skill to make sure the student isn't alienated. So when it's time to engage the student intellectually, the teachers create an environment where they're engaged. So again, I know cultural proficiency is slightly abstract until you live it, until you do it. I was just listening to actually another webinar today on transracial adoption, and it was a researcher by the name of Dr. Darren Smith who was presenting it. And a parent, and my wife and I do a lot of work in transracial adoption as well. It's a very interesting place to learn about race because you have white parents raising kids of color. There's a very immediacy to this experience. And so one of the parents asked Dr. Smith, well, we live in an all-white suburb. How do we find friends of color? And I love Dr. Smith's response. He said, well, you got to do some work. You just got to get out and do it. You got to get out of your comfort zone. You got to show some hustle. You got to get to know people of color. And so the reason why I bring this up is that so often we assume that our own lived experience is what creates the limitations to our own personal ability to understand other people's culture. Well, why did we go to college? Why did we go through school? Why have we worked hard in our careers? Because we know when we put forth an individual effort, we can learn new things. Understanding other cultures is exactly the same. And so it is a requirement upon the educators to stretch themselves, to get out into the communities of the kids, to visit students at their homes. It's one thing to meet a parent at school at parent-teacher conference. Well, at least I know now I now know the parents. But when you visit a student in their home and you see the parents and the family interacting together in their home, well, now you've started to understand the student's culture. It takes it to a whole other level. So why are we driving on this? Because if I don't understand, as an educator, if I don't understand culturally what my students are bringing, then I'm in a constant battle to keep the student engaged. So curious from you, again, if you can respond in the question box here, what do you believe is the most challenging factor of cultural proficiency when building effective school culture? Is it understanding your students according to race, economics, language, community, family background? What is the most challenging factor of cultural proficiency when building effective school culture? And please respond in the question box. Jason says, community. Cynthia, I gotta respect what you wrote here. Is this another trick question? It's not. It's not. It's not a trick question. I'm asking this honestly. And the reason why I'm asking this is, again, this gives you a place to start your work. So, as you look in these different areas, which is the one that's going to create, which already has the most distance from your staff and the students? And so, how is it, where is it that you put your effort? The beautiful thing is, so let's just hypothetically speak here. If understanding race is going to be the most challenging factor of building a greater sense of cultural proficiency in my school culture, well, if I begin with an examination of race, me and the educators I work with together, what are the things we're going to be touching upon? Well, if we serve a lot of Hispanic students, we'll immediately start talking about language. We will talk about economics, going back to Jason, what you said about this East-West community divide. You'll start engaging the community, understanding the families. The reason why I put this up here isn't so much to trick you, as you asked there, Cynthia, but it's more to make you think, where is it that you expend your effort in driving forward a conversation to build culture proficiency? each one of these is going to have some real challenging aspects to it. I mean, take economics. Not only are over 80% of educators white, well over 80% of educators came from middle-class backgrounds. And so already there's this big divide there. A teacher who did not grow up poor, struggling, supporting the bulk of the students who are. And so that's an area where there's a great divide. There's a challenge there to build that bridge, to build some of that understanding. So each of these, topics has its own, area of place where you can put a lot of effort quickly and get some, some good forward momentum with, but it also has its challenges. Race is something we can embrace very quickly around elements of diversity and acceptance, but race becomes a really tough one when you start talking about racial privilege. And when you start talking about what it means to be white versus black or brown, that's a really tough one, even though right from the get-go, almost all of your educators will say, well, I love all people, regardless of their race. So as you go through these, each of these has, its own set of challenges, but its own set of opportunities as well. The key thing is that you and your staff are deliberately making an effort to research these. Why? Because it builds that understanding on the part of the educator for who the student is when they walk in the door. So this is a quote from Jamie Almanzon. And Jamie Almanzon is a Latino educator who lives in Oakland, California, a close colleague of mine. I've always loved what he says here. Culture is the foundation of pedagogy. You teach who you are. Why is this important? Well, it's important because when I show up in the classroom, the experience I understand better than anything else is my own. So I bring myself to the forefront in the classroom. It's not until I'm aware that I am the most present person in the classroom that I can start to really make other cultures more present. So some of the other responses. Robert says language due to high Hispanic population, but all are challenging. Jack says economics. Haley, I'm so sorry, the sound is cutting out. For whatever reason, we've had bad sound on a number of people, so please forgive me for that. But going back to this quote from Jamie, culture is the foundation of pedagogy. You teach who you are. So as we build these cultural classroom equity, focusing in on the sense of expectation, rigor, and relationships, the three of these are completely interconnected. When I have a great relationship, the student will hear me when I push them to do something harder. They only do something harder if the learning is a challenge, if it's rigorous. When I have high expectations, I'm able to build those relationships with students as they succeed. So cultural classroom equity every single day is that sense of high expectation, rigor, relationship evident within the classroom. One resource, if I can point you towards, and I want to give this just as part of my background because it was such a profound experience for me, is Courageous Conversations About Race. Remember that I said I grew up in a very white environment. I did not understand the experience of color in our society today, but it wasn't until I engaged with Glenn Singleton and eventually leading to co-authoring the first edition of Courageous Conversations About Race with him that I was forced to seriously consider these things. I was forced to get out of my comfort zone. Glenn is a black man who grew up in Baltimore and now lives in the Bay Area. He has had a different experience than I have. And we are able to build an understanding, bridging our differences rather than just trying to find our similarities. So I just share it as, there are numerous resources out there that you can turn towards. So going back to this definition of equity, equity is when educators provide all students with the individual support they need to reach and exceed a common standard. Which leads us into cultural equity, school culture that invests in understanding the cultural backgrounds, characteristics, and needs of each student, while also fostering a learning culture that supports and expects high levels of engagement and student success. I really hope that today this has been beneficial for you as you consider the needs, the areas of focus to work on when building a truly equitable school culture. When you approach when you say, okay, we're taking this serious, we are truly going to build an equitable school culture, remembering cultural proficiency. Do I understand who the students are when they walk in the door? But then working on that culture of learning when they walk in the door, is the learning engaging? Is it a space of high expectations and high levels of engagement? I show this picture of my family at the end because this is why I do the work I do. I have to remember this at all times. I've got Dominic, I've got Maya, two amazing kids. And I need for them to be able to go to schools where they are embraced, they are supported, and they are understood. That's the least I can ask for as a parent, but it's also the least I can ask of myself as a professional educator. And so that's really the challenge that I leave for all of you. What is this school culture that you are building? Is it truly equitable for all students? So in closing, I can hang out for a while and answer any questions you might have, but I very much appreciate your participation in this. So please submit your questions on the question box and I'll respond to each of them individually. And if you need to leave now, thank you so much for your participation. I really appreciate it. And the other thing as well, we will have a follow-up on our last Equity 101 webinar. Will be on practice. So teaching practice. What does equitable teaching practice look like in the classroom? And Dave will send out the dates and the invite for that. Thank you much.
Very good. Thank you, Curtis. I'm just going to launch a quick poll just so we can have a little feedback on how this webinar was. I recognize we had some sound issues. For those of you who can't hear me right now, it's irrelevant, but the recording will be made available. So if you could take a little time and fill out the poll really fast, that would be fantastic. And then if you do have any questions, please feel free to post them in the questions feature and we'll be sure to answer them.
And Leonie, Dave will send on a certificate of attendance.